Now this next section will focus on imperialism in Asia. And as you can imagine, there are lots of similarities between imperialism in Africa and in Asia. It didn't really necessarily matter what continent you were on, you still saw a lot of the same similarities. Okay, so you're going to see India and China and Japan and Southeast Asia, that Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, other countries that are all going to be colonized by European powers. So one country in particular, India, which seemed to be the place that everyone wanted to get to during the Age of Exploration, they are going to be colonized by Great Britain. Now when we think of India, it was actually much larger than the India of today. Not that India is small, but it would have included the Muslim areas of Pakistan. It would have included Nepal and Bhutan and places like that as well. So they are going to be directly colonized by Great Britain, who is going to make some improvements, but will also take from India. China, the big man of the world right now, the country with the largest population and an extremely large amount of land, they were not taken by one country in particular. Instead, they were divided up in a system of what we call unequal treaties, meaning they were unequal to China. So China was the one that was receiving the negative benefits, which, of course, you can imagine with the age of imperialism. So China still maintained their own country, but what they allowed, forcibly of course, they allowed European countries to have particular spheres of influence. And again, the one that always comes to mind with me is Hong Kong. Now, Hong Kong, as of 1999, was actually transferred back to China. But from the age of imperialism up to 1999, it actually belonged to Great Britain. And Hong Kong was a little bit of an interesting story because it was capitalist throughout most of its history, yet it was located on the very edge of a communist country, and it was transferred back to communist China, of course. But it was very successful. It had this huge, awesome, booming economy, and it was a gem, literally, inside of a communist country. So that's one example of, you know, those spheres of influences in China. Now, what it allowed European countries to do was to come in to trade, and basically those spheres of influences, it was almost like they were underneath of imperial control. So, you know, if France controlled a particular area, French law applied there above Chinese law. Imperialism. The other big country that we're going to talk about is Japan. Now, Japan is an interesting story because Japan, being an island nation, for the most part throughout their history, they've been able to avoid contact with lots of other places. So when Japan was basically made contact with the United States in the later part of the 1800s, they were a very medieval society. And when I say medieval, I think like Middle-aged Europe. Okay, they had feudal systems, they had lords that controlled the manors, they had poor farmers that worked underneath of them, and they didn't trust outsiders at all. So what happened is the United States sent a fleet of naval ships into Tokyo Harbor under the leadership of Admiral Matthew Perry, and they basically, at gunpoint, forced Japan to open up to trade. Well, of course, Japan didn't like that. They take a different approach to it, though. We didn't dominate them, and I would say we, I mean the United States, didn't dominate them directly, like control their government. But instead what they began to do is they began to industrialize, they began to modernize, they're going to build up a modern navy, and in fact, what they do is they shift from being dominated to being an imperialist power themselves. They're going to take control of Korea, and when we talk about World War II, we'll talk about them seizing control of Manchuria in the 1930s and attacking Nanking in what we call the Rape of Nanking during the mid to late 1930s, which some historians say are the first shots of World War II. But their reaction to imperialism was becoming an imperialist power themselves. So what ultimately are the effects of imperialism in Asia? Well, in India, they're going to remain a British colony until 1947, 2 years after World War II ended. Now, something that you'll notice when we talk further into the future is about how you have World War II, it's all about liberty, and that these countries are being dominated by the Axis powers, and that the United States, Great Britain, and France, and the other allied countries are going to go in and we're going to liberate them. Well, then you have Great Britain, you have France, you have the United States, you have the Russian Empire, all dominating other people through imperialism. So, on one hand, we want freedom and democracy, yet on the other hand, you're not capable of ruling yourself, so we're going to control you. So in post-World War II, 1940s, 50s, you're going to see a change in that, in which nationalism will occur and people will demand their independence from imperial powers. And many of these imperial territories will gain their independence. China will continue to be dominated throughout World War II and even afterwards. And then what happens during World War II, you have three different factions of people that will fight each other. You have the Japanese, which will control a very large part of China. You will have the nationalists, which are trying to gain the control of the country back from the Japanese. And then you have a group of communists who, yes, were trying to gain their control of their country back from the Japanese, but were also trying to weaken their nationalist enemy so they could have their revolution and they could take control of their country. Okay, because they felt there were many poor people in China, and they felt as though communism would be a system that would work there, that would make things more equal. And so what happens is the communists will allow the nationalists to do a big bulk of the fighting against the Japanese, and then when the nationalists and the Japanese are both weakened, the communists will fight and will ultimately win out and seize control. Japan will become modern through industry and through military expansion. I've already spoke about them quite a bit. They become an imperial power. They're going to fight on the side of the Axis power during World War II. They will be defeated, but the seeds for what they become, the modern powerhouse, the technological powerhouse, are ultimately going to be planted during the age of imperialism, because they go from being backwards to very forward thinking. And that's the reason why so many of you guys are playing on your PlayStation 4s and you're watching Samsung televisions, even though Samsung's technically made in South Korea. They were part of Japanese territory. And the fourth area that we're going to talk about is Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. They're slowly going to win their battles of independence, mostly after World War II. One that we're going to talk very heavily about is Vietnam. Because in the 1960s and early 1970s, the United States will become involved there. And it's not like Vietnam was a territory of the United States. It was actually French territory until the Vietnamese had their own nationalistic movement and they tried to break away. And ultimately what happens after World War II is the country is going to be divided into two parts. The northern part will be administered by the Soviet Union, which will be communist, and the southern part will be administered by the United States, which will be democracy and capitalist. And those two sides will fight one another. And the United States will get involved, China will get involved, the Soviet Union will send supplies, and it blows up into one of the biggest wars that the United States has ever been involved in. Very controversial war, in fact. And you'll hear a lot more about that particular war in American history, but we'll definitely touch on it when we talk about the Cold War that follows after World War II. So,
imperialism, in a nutshell, in Asia, depends on where you were located, again, as to the type of domination that occurred. In some instances, you have direct control, like in Vietnam. In some instances, you have spheres of influence, like in China, or I guess China would be my example. And then, in the rare instance, you have Japan that breaks away and will become an imperialist power on their own. So, thanks for watching again, live from the city of Paris. I contemplated taking my phone around and recording next to some really cool stuff, but I was afraid that I would get mugged while I did that, literally. And I don't mean it to be like everyone here is out to mug you, but there are groups of people that look for opportunities to try to take from you, hence the reason why I had the nerdy wallet on earlier, which I really am wearing when I'm out on the streets. But again, thanks for watching. Imperialism over Africa and Asia. Remember, never stop learning.